Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul's Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul's Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Attackers are only getting more proficient, so how can you proactively adapt your cybersecurity strategy? Core Security by Fortra helps you uncover and prioritize the risks that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Core Impact is a penetration testing tool that safely finds and exploits vulnerabilities using the same techniques as attackers. You can conduct advanced pen tests with ease using certified exploits and automations. Take your engagements even further by pairing with our additional red teaming tools from Cobalt Strike and Outflank. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Fortra Core Security. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover in one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly, and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. I'm a little behind right now. I need to review those. I think that I probably have a couple dozen in there. Something about RSA coming up, and I've gotten so many emails. Sandy's not feeling bad for me. Sandy's got the same amount, or probably many, many more emails than I do.
I've scheduled my time to sleep, Adrian.
Let's not talk about RSA yet. We've got a couple days. All right.
Yes.
Let's savor them. All right. That is Sandy Carielli, who joins us today to talk about lessons learned from 2022's biggest data breaches and privacy violations, a recent report released from Forrester, where Sandy is a principal analyst. She covers application security with an emphasis on collaboration between security, developer, and business teams. Welcome to the show, Sandy.
Hi, Adrian. Thanks very much for having me. Great to be here. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, no, always great to talk to analysts. I'm an ex-analyst. Katie's an ex-analyst. Tyler, who just comes on for the new segments now, is an ex-analyst. So It's somewhat of a theme for this show.
Yep. Now, Tyler and I go back quite a ways. So.
Yeah, me too. Same here. So this is, I love big picture stories. I love kind of diving into I love getting into the weeds as well, but every now and then zooming out and saying, are we really focused on the right things? And data really helps us do that, I feel like. And you have some really interesting data in this report here. One of the things that really leaped out at me that I don't think about a lot are the fines. I think about it's definitely part of the direct cost, but the media is so focused on ransomware. Are they going to pay the ransomware? Are they not going to pay the ransomware? And then we hear about the class action lawsuits, and there's all of these places you have losses. And we know there's fines out there, but I hadn't actually seen the amounts for some of these fines, but it seems like there are some regulations with teeth these days.
Yes. And I suspect that part of the reason maybe that we don't think as much about the fines is that we get very caught up in the breach, and the breach is happening in the moment and we're dealing with that. The fines come later. So by the time the fines come, we've often moved on to, unfortunately, dealing with other breaches, other incidents, other issues. But the fines have been pretty significant. And when you think about what has teeth, if you look at the top 35 fines from last year, the total amount fined was about 2.7 billion in US dollars. And about half of those fines were based in Europe, and a lot of them were tied to GDPR. So we are seeing that GDPR in particular has a lot of teeth.
Yeah. I mean, fines into the billions here, right?
The total in fines was 2.7 billion for the total, and the largest fine out there, from in APAC actually was a total of $1.2 billion. The next largest one was $418 million. So there's some very large fines at the top. That second largest one of 418 million, that was Meta. And I will say that Meta and Twitter and some of the big social media companies, they were repeat offenders on the top 35 list. So we did see repeated violations from some of the companies that you would kind of expect.
Yeah, it's super interesting that that you've got both breaches and privacy abuses mixed in here, because at the end of the day, that they're both hits to the bottom line of a company. Whether they got hacked or they got fined, like at the end of the day, it comes down to dollars, right? So I think it seems natural now that I've seen you do it, to put both of those in the same report. And I'm not sure I've seen those in the same report before. Most reports will cover privacy abuses or they'll cover breaches, but usually not both in the same place. But I think it makes a lot of sense.
One of the interesting things we added in this year also, Adrian, is we didn't just cover, very often when we talk about breaches, we talk about it in terms of the number of accounts stolen, right? So the top 35 breaches had 1.2 billion stolen accounts associated with them. The other thing we included this year, and we did this for the first time, is we looked at the top cryptocurrency breaches. Obviously, in those cases, they're not really dealing with stolen credentials. What they are dealing with is stolen funds. And the cash equivalent of just the top 9 crypto breaches last year was equivalent of $2.6 billion. And that's just the top 9, which is just an amazing number.
And sorry, that's cryptocurrency theft?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So
I mean, amazing.
There are just a couple of large ones in there. Think about some of the things that made the news in the last year. We've got FTX, obviously. That's kind of the elephant in the room we have to talk about. But Binance, Ronin blockchain, Nomad, a lot of these had hundreds of millions or more worth of cryptocurrency stolen as a result, not of compromising the blockchain, but of compromising some aspect in the connective tissue, compromising some part of the centralized pieces that then allowed an attacker to get access to the funds.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing we see with cryptography. Like nobody's breaking the encryption algorithms typically. Right. Like it's because the developers put the private key in the same directory as like the directory they landed in when they hacked the system, right? It's just bad design, really bad implementation.
Do you remember, and it's a good point, because if you go back 25 years ago and you used to ask organizations, how are you protecting your application? How are you protecting your organization? And for the very new, naive folks, the some answer would be, well, we use encryption. And clearly, as we know, that's not enough. And now what we're seeing with some of the newer cryptocurrency firms is they might be talking about decentralization, but all the other pieces have to come into play too. You've got to protect the centralized parts. You have to protect the connective tissue. You have to do the right level of governance. And if not, you end up with these hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets that are being drained.
Yeah. So it seems interesting. We've seen this trend that the bad guys the cyber criminals used to be after data, right? And you pointed this out already, like they're after funds now. But interesting, like the regulations weren't quite there yet. Now the regulators are after data, and the criminals are after the money, like just trying to get it direct, whether it's BEC or ransomware, just trying to get money directly transferred to them and skip the whole step of having to fence credit cards and sell identities and stuff like that. But how do you see that continuing? Like, is that, are there any interesting trends there suggesting that's going to continue changing?
Let's talk about ransomware for a minute, because that's actually a really good example of how the landscape has shifted. When ransomware first became a thing, you'd get an email that, okay, all your data has been encrypted and we'll send you the decryption key when you send us a couple of Bitcoin or something like that. By the way, I remember the first time I heard about ransomware, it was back when I was working for RSA, and a call came into our inside sales team with someone whose data had been encrypted with the RSA algorithm, and not knowing any better, they called RSA and said, "Can you help me?" So confusion between the algorithm and the company, and then the assumption that the company could somehow find a way to decrypt this for them. And that speaks to sort of the lack of knowledge and the uphill climb that a lot of the people facing those attacks had early on. But if you look at how ransomware has evolved, the entire, okay, we're going to decrypt your data if you give us money, has turned out to be much less interesting to attackers than the we will expose your data unless you give us money. Because it turns out that's a much more useful threat. We're going to expose your customers. We're going to put you at risk. And so they're asking organizations to pay not to have the data exposed. And if, as Trend is seeing, organizations don't pay up, then they're going to get the money from selling that information on forums anyway. So either way, they kind of win financially.
Right. So I just put out an essay, actually published it via Tyler's Substack, and just be interesting to get your take on it. But it's my take on ransomware that the ransomware itself, the mechanism of how they get paid is much less important than the mechanism of, than the the cryptocurrency, the method of getting paid, the extortion piece. It seems like the most replaceable piece of that is, encrypting files isn't going to work anymore. We'll just take the data and threaten to release it. That doesn't work. Maybe they start bricking systems. Like, it seems like that part is modular, and maybe it's wrong to try and solve the lever, the thing that makes you pay the ransom, because that can be swapped out. I mean, just curious what your thoughts are on that theory.
One of the things that's become, I think it's been a source of awareness for a lot of organizations, is that the organizations that are conducting these ransomware attacks are often either state-sponsored or they're associated with governments and regions in the world that we don't necessarily want to be supporting. We saw a lot of ransomware gangs that have, for example, associated with Russia. And there's a realization now that there's going to be a lot more scrutiny if you pay up, regardless of what the attack was, regardless of whether the threat was, we're going to encrypt your data forever, we're going to expose your data, we're going to brick your machine, whatever the threat is. The incentive to pay up isn't always there, because the scrutiny that one might get after the fact of sending money to a criminal organization that has ties to a part of the world that we also have difficult interactions with, let's say, creates another level of geopolitical risk in this entire thing. And so, yes, ransomware attackers will try different approaches in order to get the money, but companies are being much more careful about not being willing to pay up. We're seeing fewer payouts.
Yeah, that's what I heard from the FBI's IC3 report for 2022. They said 40% decrease in payments. It was like 2021. I think we saw almost $1 billion paid out, and now it's under $500 million. Was last year. I thought that was really interesting.
There were some major attacks last year where the victim refused to pay out. I mean, the country of Costa Rica kind of ground to a halt because of ransomware attack, and they took a look at it and said, no, we'll figure it out. We'll deal with it. We don't want to pay up.
So if this trend continues, so another thing that I've observed about cybercrime is it doesn't really stop if you block what they're doing. If you stop what they're doing, they're going to shift to the next thing, right? They're not all going to hang up their black hats and just go legit. There's a reason that they're, that they're doing this. Other opportunities of making money just aren't there. So that's North Korea's primary source of GDP, I understand, is stealing cryptocurrency. Yeah, and it's going to continue. So if we make it hard for them to get paid from ransoms, at least in cryptocurrency, because know your customer and all that, in most of these countries, like legally, you can't pay these guys anyway if you're able to identify who they are. Like what happens? What happens if they, like, where are we pushing? This is something I'm always worried about, and I don't know the answer to it, but where are we pushing attackers to next? Like what's should we be watching out for?
With ransomware in particular, Adrian, they will still take that route. And if the company doesn't pay up, they're just going to sell those accounts off to a forum. Sell it off to someone on the dark web that's going to take those accounts and then try to use them to mount a credential stuffing attack against someone else, or use a stolen account to initiate and infiltrate another attack. We did see a number of attacks last year, again, in that top 35 breaches, where part of the attack was based on a previously stolen credential. And the attacker purchased that credential and used it to gain information and gain privileged access. So once the ransomware operators have the accounts, there are still a number of steps they can take to make more money.
That's a huge insight, because, yeah, you're right. Like, if you steal data and they don't pay the ransom, you still have their data. And that data is going to contain all kinds of stuff you can use to get into other companies. People are still putting passwords in plain text files, PDFs in there that could be useful, paths into other companies. No, that's a good point. That's a really good point.
The other thing I'll say to that is people still reuse passwords. So it's not just paths into that company, but it is attempting to take, let's say there were 100,000 credentials stolen. Try running them against a completely different website and see how many hit. Given the number of people that still reuse their passwords, you may get a 1 or 2% hit. And that could be a lot of gift card balances saved. It could be credit card information saved. You're going to make some money that way too.
Yeah. Katie, do you have any questions about the report?
Yeah, I unfortunately didn't get to see it too much ahead of time, but I think it's a great roundup. And one of the first things you mentioned is this whole idea of GDPR really starting to impact companies. And that we're looking at 5 years ago at this point. We still don't have a national privacy law here in the US. So based on what you've seen, based on this data, what are your thoughts about how all of this information, and if we were to get one of these bills passed as a law, as privacy regulation, how would that affect companies in the US? Do you think that they're set up better because a lot of them do business in Europe already? Or do you think we'd still be behind the 8 ball and companies would be willing to risk these fines? Because, as you mentioned also a little bit ago, some of these companies, they're the big tech companies. They're repeat offenders. They're weighing the costs of overhauling what they do with a fine and deciding the fine is better for them. So I know that was a lot of information packed into one very long rambling question, but what do you think the impact is, and how do you see things playing out in the US as far as potential privacy regulations and its impact on breach?
Funny you should ask that, Katie. Last year, we had our first fine as a result of CCPA, the California Privacy Act, and that was to Sephora. And Sephora had to pay $1.2 million for their violation. Some of the other violations that we saw that were in North America came from actions filed by states' attorneys general. And so we are seeing some local fining that's happening. I think that if there was a national privacy law, we would still see a lot of fines. We would still see a lot of organizations struggling to get their acts together. I don't think that we're seeing fewer fines in the US because organizations know what to do, because a lot of the organizations that are getting fined in Europe, frankly, are US headquartered or global organizations that have business in the US. I think if we had a national law, we would see similar levels of fines here as we do in Europe. And you're right. The fining that we're seeing, particularly these repeat offenders, the fact that they're willing to be repeat offenders indicates that, the amount that they're being fined isn't necessarily punitive to them. Meta faced multiple fines in the top 35. Twitter was fined once or twice. A couple of those big social media and tech firms received a lot of the top fines, and they're continuing to go about their business. And ultimately, that's just because their revenues are so high that it isn't necessarily enough of a punishment. But we do see customer perception towards those firms change, and the amount of trust that customers have in those firms evolve. So maybe the other role that the breaches and the fines have with tech firms like that is that over time, customer trust fades, customer demand for better privacy grows, and customer willingness to provide data decreases until they see changes and reforms in some of those organizations. Now, maybe that's optimistic of me, but we are seeing data that shows that customer trust of a lot of those firms is not at an all-time high, let's say.
Do you think that in the U.S. in particular, because we don't have a national privacy law, CCPA for the moment is the strongest thing that we have out there.
Yep.
Do you think that there's a little bit of I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place? Either I'm on social media or I'm not. And so I have to, look at my personal data. Either I have the convenience of shopping online or I have to go to stores and there are fewer stores. So is it kind of like consumers are throwing their hands up in the air saying, well, if I want to live in the modern world, this is just what I have to accept?
Among the most tech savvy and privacy aware, probably. I would speculate that there's a large swath of the population that doesn't even think about it. But there are certainly some people that are making that, I guess, considered decision that this is what they will give up in exchange for convenience. Because you're right, in some cases, there aren't other options. And am I willing to give up some information on my purchase history in order to get discounts at the local grocery store? Yeah, I am. Not everyone is, but most people are.
And I know this has changed a little over time, but have you seen any demographic information that says, certain people are more likely to give up that privacy? Digital natives, they've grown up with this. People who are a little bit older, maybe more skeptical, or maybe they just don't know. So as we've had more focus, more scrutiny on breaches and privacy laws, have you seen any trends or shifts even in those demographics of people who are a little more aware of what's going on and how breaches could personally affect them?
It's an interesting question. I wish I had the data in front of me, and unfortunately I don't. I think there are some demographic shifts, and there are also shifts between different countries. But I don't have the particular numbers in front of me, and I don't want to give you incorrect data. So I think I will probably leave it at that, and we can come back and talk about that at another time.
That's certainly fair. That was a question a little bit out of left field. So how do you think, we do have a couple of proposed laws here in the U.S. How do you personally see that playing out? Do you think we're going to get to a national privacy law, or do you think we're just too diverse as a country?
When Equifax was breached, what was that now, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? I think there was a lot of talk about national identity laws and a realization that maybe we didn't have the appetite for it. We seem closer on privacy laws, but I don't know. We'd have to get legislators to agree on much of anything at the moment.
And that's a totally different challenge and a totally different topic for a different time. Are you seeing, in terms of technologies and technology adoption, I was reading something else today about threat exposure management, some of the problems there. Are you seeing any specific industries that, or types of technologies, I should say, that are being more effective in helping companies prevent that breach? Like we know, for instance, AD is a problem, and therefore implementing certain types of controls can help mitigate that risk somehow. What are the top categories of controls or technologies that are more effective that companies should be considering implementing, of course, accompanied by good processes and people who know how to use them to mitigate breach?
I'd say it's pretty broad, but since I cover application security, I will say that when we look at Forrester data and we look at organizations and respondents to our surveys that have reported being breached due to an external attack, applications are one of the most common ways in, either through software supply chain, through software vulnerabilities, or even through various web vulnerabilities like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and the like. The top way in that attackers had last year, the most reported cause of external breaches was actually through software supply chain, and second was software vulnerabilities. So I'm going to come back to my particular love, AppSec, and say that a lot of application security controls, both pre-release testing to discover and remediate software flaws, and then post-deployment protections, whether you're talking web application firewall, API security, bot management, container security, and the like, are all going to be really critical to protecting the application, which is so often the way in for an attacker.
Yeah, AppSec sure has changed in the last 5 years or so, hasn't it?
It keeps me busy, let's say that.
I'm sure it does. And as far as AppSec goes and how people are looking at it, I think companies' attitudes have changed, because it used to be something where you thought you could do just a minor bit of testing and see if your apps were okay or not. But the whole landscape has changed, especially as 2020 came around. But now that the world is entering a completely different phase. And people are working from anywhere, from everywhere. Applications basically run businesses now. Are you seeing more of that adoption on the developer side, or is it still being pushed by the security side?
So a couple of points on that. One, we're seeing developers much more involved in the decision-making on application security tools, and about a third of the time, they even own the budget for these. So we're seeing developers much more engaged in that process. The other thing that I will throw out as a piece of good news is that when security leaders are asked about their top tactical priorities for the coming year, application has been the one most cited for the past few years. And it was again this year that application security, improving application and product security processes, improving the tooling, all of that, that's the top priority among organizations.
That is good news, I think. I mean, maybe not if you're the one forking over the budget, but certainly good news for businesses in terms of trust and buyers in terms of risk.
It says they understand that there's a problem and that they're willing to commit the resources and the time to fix it. And that's a great step forward right there.
Job security for you, for sure.
I will not be bored.
Yeah, that it describes the whole market of security, right? It's one of the things I love about security is it never gets boring. There's always something day to day.
Yeah.
As evidenced by the fact that we never get through all the news items in our segment every week. Never going to happen. So you mentioned, we were talking about the adversaries, the types of attacks. I want to kind of pivot to that and talk about that for a little bit here. And, I think most people know these days that attacks tend to be boring in terms of techniques and how they get in. There's a few outliers, but typically, as you were saying, it's application related or phishing related, something like that. Like, I ask you to give me your password, you give it to me, and, and bad things happen to your company. I remember 10 years ago when nation states started hacking, started doing stuff like that, or nation state related organizations. We used to advise folks. We used to tell them, look, this is not something you have to worry about. You're not a target. They're not interested in you. You're not Lockheed Martin, right? How's that changed in terms of like what you look at for?
It's a good question, because I think what we're seeing is that nation states are going after firms in the country that they want to target. And so there is potentially a little bit more that one has to be concerned about. There is this notion of retaliation. So as the geopolitical landscape evolves, it is something you have to keep an eye on a little bit more. And we're also seeing, related to that, we're seeing changes in cyber insurance approaches, where there are a lot of clauses or riders or whatever that don't include nation state attacks as one of the things that's necessarily covered. So you have to look really closely at your cyber insurance policy as well to make sure that it accounts for that. But I think all that speaks to the fact, nation state actors are going to go after a much broader range of targets than perhaps they used to. They're not just going after the big national security targets, because their goal is to cause chaos. And, they don't have to go after all the big guns all the time in order to do that. So we are definitely seeing a shift there. And it does mean that smaller organizations who may have thought, I don't have to worry about this, now do. And they need to realize it's not necessarily going to be some big fancy 0-day or APT. It could be something as simple as what we talked about before, finding a stolen credential in a trove that's for sale and using that in order to then mount an attack in the enterprise.
So knowing that, would you say most organizations should be making a shift in their strategies for defense, based on that knowledge? If assuming some of these organizations still operate the same way that they did 10 years ago, which honestly, I depressingly find quite a bit.
I think they should make a change in their threat modeling, and they should consider the geopolitical threat as one which they must consider. In terms of their defenses, I think they have to look at a lot of the same concerns that, regardless of whether you're a nation state actor or some other cybercrime criminal gang, they use, in a lot of cases, they're very, very similar approaches. You're taking advantage of phishing, you're taking advantage of stolen credentials. So the defenses may not look that dissimilar, but there may be some things that, if your threat model indicates that you are potentially subject to some other type of attack based on where you sit, then yes, you should pay attention a little bit more.
And what can I do to pull the rug out from under some of these different attacks? Because, a lot of these attacks look very, very similar. I find a lot of the ransomware attacks, when I look at the details, it just looks like a pen test, up until the point that they do whatever the ransomware piece of the attack is. Everything before that just looks like your typical pen test. What could organizations do that would just kind of pull the rug out from under, or at least get them off of that list of low-hanging fruit that's easy for these extortion crews to get into?
There are some basics, right? I mean, some of the basics in terms of adding multi-factor auth, getting rid of username password as the only way, as your sole authentication information, some of that stuff. But I think also, in terms of your detection and your response, one of the things that we talk about in AppSec, particularly in bot management, is making the attack as expensive for the attacker as possible. And if we put up enough sort of blockers and defenses to slow the attacker down, we're a less attractive target than the company next door that's easier to get into. So there is an element in this of, maybe it's not running faster than the bear, it's running faster than your friend.
Right. Yeah, until Auto GPT just, yeah, well, we won't talk about that.
Oh, God, that's a whole other conversation, Adrian.
It's terrifying, right?
Well, the interesting thing, I was talking to someone about that, and going back to phishing attacks, one of the ways in which GPT has been very effective early on is a lot of the things that we're trained to look for in phishing emails are going away because GPT is pretty good at finding and, getting rid of grammatical errors or translating in an effective way. So it really speaks to the need to not force the user to be the single point of defense.
Right. And if I can be permitted to ask a really what seems like a really dumb question, but I'm really curious about what happens to these huge GDPR fines? Does Luxembourg just have like the most perfect pothole-free roads in the world, or wherever the EU head?
It's a good question. I'm not sure.
I'm just looking at these numbers. I'm like,
yeah.
What are they doing with it? Like, surely
I have
some
to
of
assume they're funding other initiatives with it, but I've never looked at it.
Right. Yeah. It's something I've always wondered. I'll have to look up at some point. But another trend here that you mentioned in the report is fines and punishments get personal is the name of the section, which is perfect.
Yes.
But and most people know about the Joe Sullivan case, but not a lot of folks know about Drizzly's CEO getting personally sanctioned by the FTC. Maybe let's talk about that a little bit. Like is that we've got two major cases here. Are those outliers where they're just trying to make an example, or do you think that's going to become more common?
A couple of years ago, we couldn't have imagined any of this happening, right? And now we're seeing at least a couple of the examples where, a CISO is being deemed to have personal blame liability for this. A CEO is being sanctioned. A CEO is being sanctioned not just for the current company, but for where he goes afterwards. So it's not just even limited to the current position, but it's going to follow him around. And obviously, it's only a couple of examples right now, but it's enough to force CISOs to pay a little bit closer attention to their exposure and their legal coverage and realize that they may need their own legal support beyond what the company has. It also means that the CEO, since they start to see these examples, they're going to need to and want to be much more engaged and aware in their organization's cybersecurity strategy. So you're going to start seeing CEOs asking more questions of the CISO, and we are seeing a trend. Jeff Pollard has talked about this in his research. We're seeing more CISOs report directly to the CEO.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I also seen a trend where you have CIO/CISOs, where they, it's the same role. Yeah, which also reports directly to the CEO.
So
and
obviously, this changes the paradigm a little bit. People who are looking for CISO positions, they have a little more to think about. Again, limited examples, but obviously this should not be something that people disregard either. So does this change either the training, the pedigree of somebody who is a CISO? Does this change how we bring people up through the organization or the skill set? What does this do at a practical and tactical level?
I think it changes some of the due diligence, honestly, Katie. I think, if you're going into a potential CISO role, you're going to have other questions to ask in terms of liability, the company's investment, what kind of support you're going to get, because you don't want to be the one left holding the bag. It was one thing to be holding the bag and just be fired. It's another thing to be holding the bag and be fined or sent to jail.
Right. Very much so.
So yeah, I think it does cause some more questions to be asked. I think it forces you to do some more due diligence in terms of what you're actually getting from that role and the support you're going to get from the CEO, from the board. It may even force you to demand that as a condition of taking on this role, I must report to the CEO. I must be allowed to report to the board on a regular basis. It could force some more of that type of governance as well.
And in turn, if those conversations are happening regularly at the right level, does that ultimately help cybersecurity evangelize our agenda better? Does it help us get that bigger seat at the table? We're still pushing for it. In some areas They have it, but in a lot of other areas, Adrian just put up a statistic on our internal Slack. 47% of CISOs at global organizations with more than 1,000 employees now report to the CEO. That's great.
Yep.
But that means that 53% are not. So does that change how other C-levels and boards of directors look at security? If people who are candidates for CISO positions are having those much, much more serious conversations about ramifications and repercussions?
If we're doing it right, yes. If we are articulating the stories and telling them at the right business level, if we're providing metrics that are relevant to the business, relevant to the CEO versus something that's relevant to the security analyst, if we're really talking about how the security team is enabling the business, helping to drive revenue, I often write about securing what you sell. And in the product security realm, that's about putting in the right security controls to enable the sale and enable the business versus things that are going to block it or slow it down. So I think if the CISOs that are starting to report to the CEO start to position themselves as more of that business level CISO and customer facing CISO, as my colleague Jeff Pollard talks about, then you will see more CEOs and boards start to look for that skill set and embrace that from CISOs.
Yeah, so up-leveling ourselves to up-level security organizationally.
Learn to talk about the customer, learn to really be engaged with the customer, and learn to communicate at those business levels.
Know your audience.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the Drizzly CEO is part of that sanction is to reduce, for any company he works for, I think in the next 20 years or something like that, it said, like two of the three big things were privacy related, was reducing, the amount of information gathered from customers to only what's absolutely needed for business, which, seems like it could make it hard for you to get hired, hard to take a CISO role of a company when you're carrying that kind of baggage around and other people don't.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think having some sort of having that level of weight following you around. I mean, regardless of what role you're in, even if you were a CEO and you were, it wasn't a security issue and you had some sort of result like this where you had to have additional reporting or you had to have additional compliance in order to fill that role, that certainly makes you less attractive as a hire, doesn't it?
Yeah. Or as a founder, trying to raise investment.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pulling that boat anchor around. Sandy, is there anything else in this report that we've missed that you're like particularly excited to talk about, or that you want to touch on before we wrap up here?
Let's talk about Australia for a minute, shall we?
Absolutely. I love talking about Australia.
Interesting thing, if you look at the top breaches from last year, 5 of the top 35 were Australia. And almost all of them were in Q4 or the tail end of Q3. And so we had this, and you probably remember a lot of them. Everyone remembers Optus. And then there was My Deal and a couple of others where there were a very large number of records exposed in a very short time and a couple of really prominent breaches. As a result, Australia did the thing that you were asking about earlier. Australia put in place, stronger data breach laws and punishments around that because they saw this pattern and they wanted to stop it. But it was really interesting to see that where they had this pattern of a couple of very high profile breaches. After the US, they were the country that appeared the most in the top 35, and they responded to it. And I think it's a really interesting example of seeing an issue and looking for ways to try to address it.
Probably too early to tell if they, what they did had an impact.
Agreed. I think we'll need to wait another year or two to really see what happens. I haven't heard of any breaches so far this year, but that's a really small sample size, and these things tend to come in patterns. I also suspect that a lot of companies got really spooked after the first round of breaches, and they probably tightened things up quite a bit proactively.
Is this a report that you do every year? So will there be another one of these next year where we can kind of like compare, do some
that is the plan, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a team report. We have, I think this one had 6 or 7 authors, and every year a group of us will come together. It may be me, it may be somebody else, but we'll work together to comb the breach data, look for interesting trends, and then figure out what are the really interesting lessons to take away from it.
Very cool. Well, thank you for coming on and talking to us about it. This has been really interesting. This is a different way of looking at breaches, like with the privacy stuff included that I hadn't really done before.
Well, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And stick around. We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.